Hello there, night owls and mystery seekers. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, I hope you're having a peaceful day, wherever you are in this vast, curious world of ours. Take a moment to let me know in the comments how your day's been, what time it is where you are, and what you think about the missing 411 phenomenon. Do these disappearances point to natural explanations, or is there something more at play? And while you're at it, I'd love to hear what conspiracies or mysteries you'd like us to explore in future episodes. Your suggestions often lead us down the most fascinating rabbit holes. If you're new here, welcome to Sleep Theories, where we explore the unexplained, the hidden, and the stories few dare to tell. If you've been with us before, you already know the kind of journey we're about to take. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. That way you'll never miss a night of unravelling the world's most shadowed secrets. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let me tell you about Dr. Lyle Kastner, a man whose government work led him straight into a world of missing people, buried evidence, and a dimensional secret darker than anything he could have imagined. Dr. Lyle Kastner had always found solace in numbers. Equations didn't lie, atmospheric readings didn't manipulate, and electromagnetic frequencies couldn't be bought or silenced, which made his current assignment all the more disturbing. The DARPA laboratory in Cheyenne was sterile and windowless, the kind of place where secrets went to multiply in the fluorescent darkness. Kastner's workstation was cluttered with printouts showing electromagnetic anomalies from across the American West, but his focus kept returning to one particular cluster of readings from Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. The spikes were impossible. Clean, geometric patterns that defied every known atmospheric phenomenon. They appeared in bursts, lasted exactly 43 minutes, and occurred in the same locations with mathematical precision. What made them truly unsettling was their timing. Each spike corresponded exactly with a documented missing 411 case. Dr. Kastner, the voice belonged to Colonel Morrison, his DARPA liaison. The man's face was the kind of military blank that suggested he'd seen too much and decided to feel nothing about it. "We need to discuss your findings." Kastner looked up from his monitors, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd been working for 18 hours straight, surviving on coffee and the gnawing certainty that he was uncovering something that shouldn't exist. "The electromagnetic signatures are unlike anything in the literature, Colonel. The patterns suggest..." "Doctor!" Morrison's tone carried the weight of classification stamps and buried reports. "I need to know if these readings represent a threat to national security." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Kastner had learned over his 12 years of government work that certain questions were really statements. This was one of them. "The patterns are consistent with theoretical models of dimensional membrane stress," Kastner said carefully. "If I had to guess, I'd say we're looking at evidence of spatial temporal distortion, but that's impossible according to current physics." Morrison nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid you'd say. Pack your equipment, Doctor. You're going to Wyoming." 3 hours later, Kastner was in a government SUV winding through the mountain roads towards Shoshone National Forest. His driver, a stone-faced agent who'd introduced himself only as Phillips, had said maybe 10 words during the entire journey. The silence gave Kastner time to think, which was never a good thing when working for DARPA. The missing 411 cases were what bothered him most. He'd done his homework during the flight, reading through David Paulides' research and the thousands of unexplained disappearances in national parks. The pattern was always the same. People vanished without a trace, often in impossible circumstances. No scent trails for search dogs to follow, no signs of struggle, no logical explanation for how someone could simply cease to exist. What the public didn't know, what Kastner had learned through his security clearance, was that the government had been tracking these disappearances for decades. There were files, classifications, and protocols that suggested the authorities knew far more than they were admitting. As they approached the forest, Kastner's portable electromagnetic detector began clicking erratically. The closer they got to the coordinates from his research, the more agitated the readings became. "We're here," Phillips announced, pulling into a small parking area beside a Forest Service road. "Your contact is waiting." Kastner gathered his equipment and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The silence was immediate and profound, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat. Standing beside a ranger station was a woman in her early 40s, lean and intense, with the kind of weathered look that came from spending too much time outdoors searching for answers. "Dr. Kastner," she extended her hand. "I'm Sadie Ellman. I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time." Kastner shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "I'm afraid I don't understand. My assignment here is classified." Sadie smiled, but there was no humour in it. "Doctor, I've been tracking electromagnetic anomalies in this forest for 3 years. I know about the DARPA contracts, the classified readings, and the fact that your government is covering up something that took my brother 26 years ago." The electromagnetic detector in Kastner's hand began clicking faster, its rhythm becoming almost frantic. Somewhere in the distance, a sound that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite voices drifted through the trees. "I think," Sadie continued, "it's time we had a very serious conversation." The ranger station was small and cluttered, filled with maps, photographs and newspaper clippings that painted a picture of systematic disappearances dating back to the early 1900s. Sadie had converted the space into a makeshift research centre, complete with computer terminals, radio equipment, and what appeared to be sophisticated electromagnetic monitoring gear. 26 years ago, Sadie began, spreading a detailed topographical map across the table. My 10-year-old brother Isaac vanished during a family camping trip. Right here. She pointed to a location marked with a red X. The search lasted 3 weeks. They found nothing. No footprints, no scent trail, no torn clothing. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. Kastner studied the map, noting the granite formations and the precise coordinates. They matched his electromagnetic readings perfectly. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm not sure how this relates to my research, because it's not just Isaac." Sadie pulled out a thick folder filled with case files. Patricia Hernandez, aged 8, disappeared in 1983. Marcus Thompson, aged 12, vanished in 1994. Jenny Walsh, aged 9, disappeared in 2001. All within a 2-mile radius of this location, all under identical circumstances. The pattern was undeniable. Every case occurred in the same geological area, a region dominated by granite boulder fields and underground mineral deposits. The timing was equally significant. The disappearances happened in clusters, with years of quiet between each incident. "There's more," Sadie continued. 3 months ago, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all government documents related to disappearances in Shoshone National Forest. What I received was almost entirely redacted, but there were a few details that slipped through. She handed Kastner a heavily censored document. Most of it was blacked out, but he could make out references to echo anomalies, dimensional membrane stress, and coordinates that matched his electromagnetic readings. "Echo anomalies," Kastner repeated. "That's not standard government terminology." "No, it's not. But I found a reference to it in a declassified document from the 1970s. Sadie pulled up a file on her computer. Project Pegasus, time travel experiments. They used the term echo to describe temporal distortions caused by dimensional rifts. Kastner's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers of Pegasus during his time at DARPA, but it was one of those programs that existed in the shadows, referenced only in hushed conversations and classified briefings. The official position was that it had never existed. "You're suggesting that the government has been experimenting with dimensional manipulation in this forest," Kastner said slowly, "and that these experiments are responsible for the disappearances." "I'm not suggesting anything," Sadie replied. "I'm telling you what the evidence shows. My brother didn't just vanish. He was taken, and whoever took him is still out there." The electromagnetic detector on Kastner's belt began clicking again, its rhythm becoming more insistent. He pulled it out and watched the needle swing wildly across the display. "It's starting," Sadie said, moving to her radio equipment. "Every time the electromagnetic activity spikes, we get reports of strange phenomena. Compass needles spinning, electronics failing, people reporting voices in languages they don't recognize." Kastner's training kicked in. He began taking readings, documenting the electromagnetic signatures with scientific precision. The patterns were extraordinary, geometric frequencies that seemed to pulse with mathematical intelligence. It was as if the very fabric of space-time was vibrating in response to some external force. "Dr. Kastner," a voice crackled through Sadie's radio. "This is Cole Varick. We have a situation." Sadie grabbed the radio. "Cole, this is Sadie. What's your location?" "I'm at the old observation tower, about 2 miles north of your position. I've got hikers reporting lost time and missing equipment. Whatever's happening, it's starting again." Cole Varick arrived 20 minutes later, a grizzled man in his 60s with the kind of weathered face that came from 30 years of ranger work. He carried himself with the casual authority of someone who'd seen every kind of wilderness emergency, but his eyes held something deeper, a wariness that suggested he'd encountered things that weren't in any ranger manual. "Dr. Kastner," he said, extending his hand. "I've been expecting you." "You have?" "Government contracts don't stay secret in a place like this," Cole explained. "Word gets around. What I want to know is whether you're here to help or to cover things up." Kastner found himself looking between Cole and Sadie, two people who clearly knew more about his assignment than he did. "I'm here to study electromagnetic anomalies. Beyond that, I'm not sure what my role is supposed to be." Cole nodded slowly. "Then let me show you something that might clarify things." He led them to a storage room behind the ranger station, where he produced a metal briefcase secured with multiple locks. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be physical evidence from decades of unexplained incidents. "I worked this forest for 30 years, Cole said. "I've seen things that would end my career if I reported them officially. Missing persons cases where the victims reappeared days later, with no memory of where they'd been. Hikers who aged years in a matter of hours. Equipment that malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation." He handed Kastner a photograph. It showed a clearing in the forest, but the trees around the edges were blurred and distorted, as if the image had been taken through rippling water. "This was taken during my final year as a ranger," Cole continued. "I was investigating reports of strange lights and electromagnetic disturbances. What I found was a section of forest where the laws of physics seemed to break down." Kastner studied the photograph, his scientific mind racing. The distortions were consistent with gravitational lensing, the kind of effect that occurred when space-time itself was warped. But that was impossible at this scale unless... "Unless what, Doctor?" Sadie asked, apparently reading his expression. "Unless we're looking at evidence of a dimensional rift," Kastner said quietly. "A tear in the fabric of reality itself." The electromagnetic detector began clicking frantically, its display showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. Outside, the wind had died to complete stillness, and the normal sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had ceased entirely. "It's happening again," Cole said, his voice tight with decades of suppressed fear. "God help us all. It's happening again." The silence was absolute. In 30 years of wilderness work, Cole had never experienced anything like it, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from the spaces between reality. Kastner's equipment was going haywire. The electromagnetic detector was clicking so rapidly it sounded like a Geiger counter in a radiation zone, and his portable spectrometer was displaying readings that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Most disturbing of all, his GPS unit kept losing signal, the coordinates flickering between their actual location and somewhere that didn't exist on any map. "We need to move," Sadie said, gathering her equipment with practiced efficiency. "If this follows the same pattern as the previous incidents, we have maybe 40 minutes before the activity peaks." "Move where?" Kastner asked, still trying to process readings that suggested the local gravitational field was fluctuating in impossible ways. "Zone echo," Cole replied grimly. "The area I've been monitoring for the past year is where the dimensional membrane is thinnest." They loaded their gear into Cole's ranger vehicle and headed deeper into the forest, following a service road that wasn't marked on any official maps. The trees grew denser as they travelled, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out most of the daylight. The electromagnetic readings grew stronger with each mile, and Kastner's instruments began detecting frequencies that shouldn't have existed in nature. "Tell me about your brother," Kastner said to Sadie as they drove. "What exactly happened the day he disappeared?" Sadie's grip tightened on her equipment case. "We were camping with my parents at Yellowstone Creek. Isaac was always wandering off. He was curious about everything, always asking questions about rocks and trees and animals. That morning he asked if he could explore the granite formations about a quarter-mile from our campsite. My parents said yes, as long as he stayed within shouting distance." She paused, her voice becoming distant. "He was gone for maybe 20 minutes. When we went looking for him, we found his shoes at the base of a large boulder. Just his shoes, neatly placed as if he'd taken them off intentionally. Everything else, his jacket, his backpack, his compass, was gone." "No footprints?" Kastner asked. "None. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. The search and rescue teams brought in dogs, helicopters, professional trackers. They found nothing. The official report concluded that he'd probably fallen into a hidden crevice or been taken by a wild animal, but that didn't explain the complete absence of evidence." Cole turned onto an even smaller trail, barely wide enough for the vehicle. "We're entering the perimeter of Zone Echo," he announced. "From here on, things get strange." As if responding to his words, Kastner's compass began spinning wildly, its needle unable to find magnetic north. The air itself seemed to shimmer, creating optical distortions that made distant objects appear closer than they were. Most unsettling of all, the shadows beneath the trees seemed to move independently of their sources, shifting and flowing like liquid darkness. "Stop the vehicle," Kastner said suddenly. Cole brought the truck to a halt. "What is it?" "The electromagnetic readings just spiked beyond anything I've ever recorded. We're close to the source." They climbed out and gathered their equipment. The forest around them was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of wildlife. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the air itself was reluctant to move through this space. "There," Sadie pointed to a structure barely visible through the trees. "That's the old ranger outpost Cole mentioned. It's been abandoned for 20 years. The building was small and weathered, constructed from logs that had darkened with age. Windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. But what made Kastner's scientific mind recoil was the space around the structure. It seemed to bend and warp, creating visual distortions that hurt to look at directly. "I found it during my last year as a ranger," Cole explained. "It's not on any official maps, and there are no records of its construction. But there are files inside that suggest it was used for some kind of monitoring operation." As they approached the building, Kastner's electromagnetic detector began clicking so rapidly that it sounded like electronic screaming. The readings were off the charts, suggesting electromagnetic activity that should have been lethal to human life. "How is this possible?" Kastner muttered, checking his instruments. "The electromagnetic field strength here should be frying our nervous systems." "Because we're not entirely in normal space-time," Cole replied. "Whatever's happening here, it's creating a pocket of altered reality." The door to the outpost creaked open at Sadie's touch, revealing an interior that shouldn't have been possible. The single room was larger inside than the exterior dimension suggested, and the walls were covered with maps, photographs and documents that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. "Jesus," Sadie whispered, moving to examine a wall covered with missing person reports. "These go back to the 1920s. Kastner found himself drawn to a desk covered with scientific equipment from various eras. Some pieces looked like they belonged in a modern laboratory, while others appeared to be from the 1950s or earlier. All of it was connected by cables and wires that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. "Look at this," Cole called from the opposite wall. He was standing before a filing cabinet labelled Seraph Protocol, Deviation Events, Do Not Open. The drawers were secured with locks that looked far more sophisticated than anything that belonged in an abandoned forest outpost. Sadie pulled out a set of lockpicks. "Don't ask where I learned to do this." The locks yielded to her expertise, and the filing cabinet opened to reveal folders filled with documents that made Kastner's blood run cold. Reports of temporal displacement events, dimensional breach protocols, and subject retrieval operations dating back decades. "My God," Kastner breathed. reading through a file labelled Echo 44 Temporal Displacement Analysis. They've been monitoring dimensional rifts here for over 50 years. But it was Sadie who made the discovery that changed everything. At the bottom of the filing cabinet, she found a manila envelope marked with a date from 2019. Inside was a single photograph, blurry and distorted, but unmistakably showing a young boy standing in a clearing that looked exactly like the area around the outpost. The boy was Isaac Ellman, apparently unchanged from the day he'd disappeared 26 years earlier. "This is impossible," Sadie whispered, her hands shaking as she held the photograph. "This was taken 3 years ago. He should be 36 years old now." Cole took the photograph and studied it carefully. "Look at the background. See how the trees are distorted? This wasn't taken in our normal space-time. This was taken on the other side of the rift." Kastner found another file that made his scientific worldview crumble. The document was titled Temporal Stability Analysis, Echo Zone Manifestations, and it contained detailed records of people who had vanished and reappeared, but with temporal discrepancies that defied explanation. "Listen to this," he read aloud. Subject 23A disappeared on July 15, 1987, and was recovered on August 2, 1987. However, subject exhibited signs of having aged approximately 3 years during the 18-day absence. Medical examination revealed cellular aging consistent with prolonged exposure to accelerated temporal flow. "And this one," he continued, subject 31B disappeared on March 8, 1993, and was recovered on March 12, 1993. Subject appeared to have aged backward by approximately 5 years. Subject retained no memory of the displacement event and was processed according to Class C amnesia protocols. The implications were staggering. The government hadn't just been covering up disappearances, they'd been actively retrieving people from dimensional rifts and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement. "There's more," Sadie said, pulling out a final document. "This is a schedule. It shows that the dimensional rift stabilizes on a 27-year cycle. The next stabilization window is July 9th, Cole finished. Today." The electromagnetic detector began screaming, its readings climbing beyond anything Kastner had ever recorded. Outside, the air itself seemed to be vibrating, and the shadows beneath the trees began moving with purposeful intelligence. "We need to leave," Kastner said, his scientific training warring with a growing sense of primal fear. "Whatever's about to happen, we shouldn't be here when it does." But even as he spoke, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed through the forest. Not the rough sound of ranger trucks, but the smooth purr of government sedans moving fast through the wilderness. "They're coming," Cole said grimly, "the containment team." Through the outpost windows they could see black SUVs surrounding the building, their occupants wearing tactical gear that was far more sophisticated than anything used by local law enforcement. "Dr. Kastner," a voice called through a megaphone. "This is Agent Marcus Clem, Department of Interior. You're in violation of federal security protocols. Exit the building immediately." Kastner looked at his companions, realizing that they'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. Whatever was happening in Zone Echo, the government was willing to use extreme measures to keep it secret. "There's a back exit," Cole whispered, "but it leads directly into the heart of the dimensional distortion field." "Better than a black site prison," Sadie replied, gathering the documents and photographs. "If we're going to expose this, we need to survive long enough to tell the story." The electromagnetic readings spiked again, and the very air around them began to shimmer with otherworldly energy. Somewhere in the distance, a sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite machine began to echo through the forest. The dimensional rift was opening, and they were about to discover what lay on the other side. Agent Marcus Clem was the kind of man who made bureaucratic nightmares seem friendly. Tall, immaculately dressed despite the wilderness setting, he moved with the calculated precision of someone who had spent decades making problems disappear. His smile was professional and utterly without warmth. "Dr. Kastner," he said, stepping into the outpost as if he owned it. "I'm afraid your research has strayed into areas that threaten national security." Behind him, a team of tactical operatives began systematically dismantling the equipment in the outpost. They worked with the efficiency of people who had performed this exact operation many times before, carefully cataloguing and removing every piece of evidence. Agent Clem, Kastner replied, trying to maintain his composure. I'm here under direct orders from DARPA. Any interference with my research would require authorization from me, Clem interrupted, producing a document that bore seals and signatures that made Kastner's security clearance look like a library card. As of this moment, you are relieved of your assignment and placed under protective custody. Sadie stepped forward, her camera recording everything. Protective custody? Are you threatening a federal researcher? Clem's smile widened. Ms. Ellman, isn't it? I'm familiar with your work. 3 years of FOIA requests, illegal surveillance of government operations, and now trespassing on classified federal property. I'm afraid your investigation ends here. You can't suppress this, Sadie said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. People have a right to know what happened to their loved ones. People have a right to live in a world where certain truths remain classified, Clem replied. Trust me, Miss Ellman, some secrets are buried for the protection of everyone. The electromagnetic detector in Kastner's pocket began clicking frantically, its rhythm becoming so rapid it sounded like electronic panic. The air around them started to shimmer, and the shadows in the corners of the outpost began moving independently of their sources. Sir, one of the tactical operatives said, his voice tight with tension, we're getting massive electromagnetic readings. The event is starting ahead of schedule. Clem's professional composure cracked slightly. That's impossible. The calculations showed we had at least 6 hours. The calculations were wrong, Cole said grimly. The dimensional rift doesn't follow human schedules. As if responding to his words, the air in the centre of the outpost began to ripple like water. The distortion grew larger, revealing glimpses of another place, a mirror image of the forest that was wrong in ways that made the human mind recoil. Evacuation protocol, Clem ordered. Everyone out now. But it was too late. The dimensional rift expanded with sudden violence, encompassing half the outpost in a sphere of writhing space-time. The government operatives who were closest to the distortion simply vanished, their equipment clattering to the floor as if they had never existed. The documents, Sadie shouted, grabbing the files from the cabinet. We need to get these out of here. Kastner found himself torn between scientific fascination and survival instinct. The readings from his equipment were beyond anything in the literature, representing a breakthrough in dimensional physics that could revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. But the look in Agent Clem's eyes suggested that such knowledge came with a price that few were willing to pay. Dr. Kastner, Clem said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, you don't understand what you're dealing with. The people who go through that rift don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all. Then tell me the truth, Kastner replied. What is this place? What happened to the missing people? Clem looked around the outpost, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. This is where we learned that reality has cracks, places where the membrane between dimensions is thin enough that people can slip through. We've been monitoring these sites for 70 years, trying to understand them, trying to control them. And the disappearances? Most of them are accidents, people who wandered into dimensional hotspots at the wrong time. But some, Clem's voice trailed off, some were experiments, government-sanctioned research into the nature of parallel dimensions. The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kastner felt his world shifting, the comfortable certainties of his scientific career crumbling in the face of evidence that the government had been actively experimenting with forces beyond human comprehension. My brother, Sadie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Was he an experiment? Clem's silence was answer enough. The dimensional rift continued to expand, its edges crackling with energy that made the air itself seem to sing. Through the distortion, they could see the other side, a version of the forest that was simultaneously familiar and alien, where the trees grew in impossible directions and the sky held colours that had no names. We need to go, Cole said, moving toward the back exit. The containment protocols for this kind of event involve sterilization of the entire area. Sterilization? Kastner asked. Tactical nuclear device, Clem confirmed. It's the only way to ensure the dimensional rift doesn't spread beyond the immediate area. The revelation hit Kastner like a physical blow. The government wasn't just covering up disappearances. They were prepared to destroy entire sections of wilderness to maintain the secret. How many times? He asked. How many times have you done this?" "Enough," Clem replied, "and we'll do it again if necessary." But even as he spoke, Sadie was moving toward the dimensional rift, the photograph of her brother clutched in her hand. "If he's in there, if he's still alive after all these years, I'm going to find him." "Sadie, no," Cole shouted. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," she replied. "I'm going to get my brother back." Before anyone could stop her, she stepped through the dimensional rift and vanished into the writhing space-time distortion. The air where she had been standing rippled like disturbed water, and then she was gone. "Damn it," Clem cursed. "Initiate emergency protocols. We have a civilian breach." Kastner found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could follow the government operatives to safety, allow them to destroy the evidence and continue the cover-up. Or he could follow Sadie through the dimensional rift and risk everything to uncover the truth. The electromagnetic detector in his pocket was screaming now, its readings climbing beyond anything his equipment could measure. The dimensional rift was fully open, revealing a pathway to a place where the laws of physics were merely suggestions. "Dr. Kastner," Clem said, his voice carrying the weight of classified authority. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. Some doors are meant to stay closed." But Kastner was already moving, his scientific curiosity overriding his survival instinct. He grabbed his equipment and stepped toward the dimensional rift, feeling the air around him begin to change in ways that his instruments couldn't measure. "See you on the other side," he called to Cole, and then stepped through the barrier between worlds. The last thing he heard was Agent Clem shouting evacuation orders and the distant sound of helicopters approaching through the forest. The other side of the dimensional rift was a place where familiar became foreign, where the Shoshone National Forest existed in a state of perpetual twilight that felt like the moment between sleeping and waking. The trees were the same species, but they grew in spirals that defied gravity, their branches reaching toward a sky that shifted between deep purple and silver grey. The air tasted of ozone and possibility, crackling with energy that made Kastner's skin tingle. His electromagnetic detector was useless here, its readings fluctuating so wildly that the display looked like electronic noise. But he could feel the dimensional energy around him, a constant low-level vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. "Sadie," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the altered space. "Where are you?" Her response came from somewhere ahead, distorted by the dimensional field but unmistakably relieved. "Kastner, thank God. I was afraid I'd lost you." He found her standing in a clearing that was simultaneously exactly like the area around the outpost and completely different. The granite formations were the same, but they pulsed with internal light that created shifting patterns across their surfaces. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, but his instruments detected gravitational anomalies that suggested they were walking on something that wasn't quite matter as humans understood it. "The readings here are incredible," Kastner said, checking his equipment. "The dimensional membrane is completely destabilized. We're existing in a space that's partially outside normal space-time." "I don't care about the readings," Sadie replied, her voice tight with decades of suppressed hope. "I care about finding my brother." She was holding the photograph from the outpost, the image of young Isaac that had been taken 3 years earlier. In the strange light of the dimensional rift, the picture seemed to shimmer and move, as if the boy in the image was trying to step out of the paper. "We need to be careful," Kastner warned. "The temporal flow here is unstable. Time might not work the way we're used to." As if responding to his words, the forest around them began to change. The trees shifted and flowed like liquid, their positions rearranging themselves in patterns that followed no earthly logic. The clearing where they stood remained stable, but everything beyond it seemed to exist in a state of constant flux. "There!" Sadie pointed to a figure moving through the shifting landscape. "Someone's coming." The figure approached with the uncertain gait of someone who had been walking for a very long time. As it drew closer, Kastner could see that it was a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing clothes that were both timeless and somehow out of place. "Isaac?" Sadie whispered. The boy looked up at the sound of his name, and his face broke into a smile that was exactly as Sadie remembered it. "Sadie, I knew you'd come for me. I've been waiting." She ran to him, dropping to her knees and pulling him into an embrace that seemed to anchor both of them to the unstable reality around them. But even as she held him, Kastner could see the wrongness in the situation. The boy hadn't aged a day in 26 years, but his eyes held depths that suggested he had experienced things that no child should ever see. "Isaac, what happened to you?" Sadie asked, her voice breaking. "Where have you been all this time?" "Here," he replied simply, "waiting for you to find me. The others said you would come eventually." "What others?" Isaac pointed to the shifting forest around them. "The ones who got lost like me. They're still here, but they're different now. Time works differently here, Sadie. Sometimes I'm 10 years old, sometimes I'm older, sometimes I'm younger, but I always remember you." Kastner's instruments detected massive temporal distortions centered on the boy. Whatever had happened to him during his 26 years in the dimensional rift, it had fundamentally altered his relationship with time itself. "We need to get you out of here," Sadie said, helping Isaac to his feet. "Back to the real world." "But this is real," Isaac replied, his child's voice carrying undertones of vast adult knowledge. "It's just different. The people who brought me here, they're trying to understand how the barriers work. They said they needed children because our minds are more flexible." "What people?" Kastner asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "The ones in the white coats," Isaac said. "They have machines that can open doorways between worlds. They said they were trying to help people, but I think they were just trying to learn things they shouldn't know." The confirmation of government experimentation hit Kastner like a physical blow. The disappearances weren't just accidents. They were part of a systematic program to study dimensional rifts using human subjects. "We're leaving," Sadie said firmly. "All of us, right now." But as they started back toward the dimensional rift, the landscape around them began to shift more violently. The trees twisted into impossible configurations, and the ground beneath their feet rippled like disturbed water. "Something's wrong," Isaac said, his young face creased with worry that belonged to someone much older. "The doorway's becoming unstable." Through the dimensional barrier they could see the real world, or what was left of it. Government vehicles surrounded the outpost, and men in hazmat suits were setting up equipment that looked ominous in its precision. "They're preparing to seal the rift," Kastner realized, his blood running cold. "If they close it while we're still in here, we'll be trapped," Sadie finished. "Forever." The dimensional barrier began to contract, its edges sparking with violent energy. Whatever the government team was doing on the other side, it was destabilizing the entire pocket dimension. "There's another way," Isaac said suddenly. "The others showed me, but someone has to stay behind to keep the pathway open." Cole's voice crackled through the dimensional static transmitted by equipment that shouldn't have worked across the barrier between worlds. "Sadie, Kastner, can you hear me? I'm holding them off as long as I can, but you need to get out now." Through the shrinking portal they could see Cole standing between the government operatives and their equipment, his ranger's authority the only thing preventing them from completing their containment protocol. "Go," he called to them. "Get that boy home where he belongs." The dimensional rift contracted further, its edges now crackling with energy that hurt to look at directly. Isaac grabbed Sadie's hand and pulled her toward the barrier, his small frame somehow anchoring them both to the shifting reality. "When we go through," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 26 years of accumulated wisdom, "I might change. The time differential, I might age all at once." "I don't care," Sadie replied, tears streaming down her face. "You're my brother. Whatever happens, we face it together." They stepped through the dimensional rift just as it collapsed behind them, the otherworldly forest vanishing into a point of light that winked out like a dying star. On the other side, they emerged into chaos. Government operatives were shouting orders, their containment equipment sparking and failing as the dimensional energies discharged into the normal world. Agent Clem was screaming into a radio, his professional composure completely shattered. "Containment failed," he was saying. "Repeat, containment failed. The subjects have returned." Cole lay on the ground near the outpost, his breathing shallow but steady. The government team's equipment had overloaded when he interfered with their protocols, and the resulting electromagnetic pulse had knocked him unconscious. But it was Isaac who drew everyone's attention. As the dimensional energies faded from his body, he began to age rapidly, 26 years of accumulated time catching up with him in a matter of seconds. His features shifted and matured, his body growing taller and stronger, until he stood before them as a 36-year-old man who still had his sister's eyes. "Hello, Sadie," he said, his voice deeper now but still unmistakably her brother's. "I told you I'd remember you." Agent Clem stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon, but Kastner intercepted him. "Don't even think about it. Too many people know the truth now." "Dr. Kastner," Clem said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "you don't understand the implications. If this information becomes public—" "Then maybe it's time the public knew," Kastner replied. "Maybe it's time we stopped treating human beings as test subjects for dimensional experiments." 6 months later, Dr. Lyle Kastner sat in a small apartment in Denver, staring at a computer screen filled with data that officially didn't exist. The government had kept its word about the non-disclosure agreements. No one who had been present during the Zone Echo incident was allowed to discuss it publicly. But they couldn't stop him from thinking, from analysing, from understanding the implications of what they had discovered. Sadie had adapted to having her brother back with remarkable resilience. Isaac, now going by his full name, Isaac Elman Varick in honour of Cole, who had died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks after the incident, had struggled with existing in a world that had aged 26 years without him. But he was adjusting, learning to navigate a reality where smartphones and social media existed alongside memories of a forest, where time flowed like honey and space folded in on itself. The official reports had classified the entire incident as a geological instability event that had required emergency evacuation of the area. Zone Echo was now permanently off-limits to civilian access, surrounded by fencing and monitoring equipment that ensured no one would accidentally stumble into another dimensional rift. But the truth had a way of spreading, despite government efforts to contain it. Missing 411 researchers had begun documenting similar electromagnetic anomalies at other national parks. Families of disappeared persons were asking harder questions about official explanations. The conspiracy theories that had once seemed far-fetched were beginning to look like conservative estimates of the truth. Kastner's computer chimed with an incoming message. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the content made his blood freeze. "Dr. Kastner," the message read, "the Echo Protocol is not unique to Shoshone. There are 17 active sites across North America, and the dimensional barriers are weakening. The 27-year cycle is accelerating. The next convergence is in 18 months. If you want to prevent a dimensional cascade that could destabilize reality itself, meet us at the coordinates attached to this message. Come alone. Trust no one from the government. They are no longer in control of this situation." Attached to the message were coordinates for a location in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, along with a single photograph that made Kastner's hands shake. It showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing in a clearing that was wrong in all the same ways that Zone Echo had been wrong. She was holding a sign that read "Help Us" in a child's careful handwriting. But what made the image truly terrifying was the timestamp. It had been taken 3 days ago. Kastner closed his laptop and reached for his phone. Sadie answered on the second ring. "It's starting again, isn't it?" she said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because I just received a package," she replied, her voice tight with familiar determination. "A cassette tape labelled Echo 44B. It contains a recording of my own voice, warning myself about something that hasn't happened yet." Kastner felt the familiar sensation of reality shifting around him, the same feeling he'd experienced in the dimensional rift. Whatever they had uncovered in Zone Echo, it was far from over. "The coordinates," Sadie continued, "Washington State. I'll pick you up in 2 hours." "This could be a trap," Kastner warned. "Everything about this has been a trap from the beginning," Sadie replied. "But those children in the other dimensions are still waiting for someone to bring them home." As Kastner hung up the phone and began gathering his equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not by government agents or military operatives, but by something that existed in the spaces between worlds, something that had been waiting patiently for the barriers between dimensions to weaken enough for it to cross over. The missing 411 cases weren't just random disappearances. They were part of something larger, something that had been building for decades. And now, as the dimensional rifts began to destabilize across the continent, humanity was about to discover that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. In the distance, thunder rolled across the Denver skyline. Though the weather reports had called for clear skies, the electromagnetic detector in Kastner's equipment bag began clicking softly, its rhythm matching the pattern of his heartbeat. The echo was spreading and time was running out. A mission so secret that for 60 years it existed only in the shadows of government archives and the nightmares of those who lived it. This is the story of the Serpo Protocol. July 8th, 1947, Roswell, New Mexico. The desert stretched endlessly under the unforgiving New Mexico sun, its silence broken only by the distant rumble of military vehicles converging on coordinates that would soon be erased from every map. Major William Blanchard stood at the edge of what the press would later call a weather balloon crash site, watching as soldiers in hazmat suits carefully extracted something that defied every law of physics he'd learned at West Point. The craft was no larger than a school bus, its surface a seamless amalgamation of metal that seemed to shift colour in the harsh sunlight. But it wasn't the technology that made Blanchard's hands tremble as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. It was the bodies. 3 of them, humanoid but wrong, in ways that made his brain struggle to process what his eyes were seeing. Grey skin with an almost translucent quality, oversized heads that seemed too heavy for their thin necks, and eyes that remained open even in death, black and vast as the void between stars. 2 were clearly dead, their bodies twisted from the impact, but the third one moved. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Martinez, the first man to reach the site. "It's still breathing." Dr. Detlev Bronk, the biophysicist who'd been hastily flown in from Johns Hopkins, knelt beside the surviving being with the careful precision of a man who understood he was witnessing history. The creature's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost human, but not quite. When their eyes met, Bronk later wrote in his classified report, he felt something he couldn't explain. Not fear exactly, but a profound sense of being observed by an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. "We need to keep it alive," Bronk said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "This changes everything." General Nathan Twining, who had arrived from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base just hours earlier, nodded grimly. "Doctor, you have unlimited resources and absolute secrecy. Make it happen." What followed were 18 months of the most intensive interspecies communication effort in human history. The being, designated as Extraterrestrial Biological Entity 1, or EBE-1, was housed in a specially constructed facility beneath Wright-Patterson. Teams of linguists, mathematicians and physicists worked around the clock to establish some form of communication with their guest. The breakthrough came in the form of mathematics. Universal constants, it turned out, were truly universal. Pi, the speed of a light, the golden ratio, these became the building blocks of a crude but functional communication system. EB1 drew complex diagrams in the sand of his containment area, star charts that mapped constellations invisible to the naked eye from Earth. Through painstaking months of mathematical exchanges, a story emerged. EBE-1 was from a planet they called Serpo, orbiting a binary star system in what humans knew as Zeta Reticuli. His people, the Ebens, had been observing Earth for centuries, studying human development with the patience of beings who measured time in millennia rather than decades. The crash at Roswell hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate landing gone wrong, the first attempt at formal contact with the dominant species of the third planet from Sol. EB-1's ship had been damaged by atmospheric electrical interference. technology that worked perfectly in the thin atmosphere of Serpo, but failed catastrophically in Earth's denser air. But the most shocking revelation came in December 1950, when EB-E1, through a series of increasingly complex mathematical proofs, indicated that more of his people were coming. Not as invaders, but as diplomats. They wanted to establish what humans would later term an exchange program. President Eisenhower, briefed on the situation in a meeting so classified that no official record exists, reportedly sat in stunned silence for 10 minutes before speaking. "Gentlemen," he finally said, "we're no longer alone. God help us all." The deal was formalised in a series of secret meetings between 1952 and 1954. The Ebens would share their technology, their knowledge of the cosmos, and their understanding of physics that made interstellar travel possible. In exchange, they requested something that seemed almost innocent. They wanted to study human culture, human biology, and human psychology by hosting a small group of volunteers on their home world. 12 humans would travel to Serpo. The mission would last approximately 10 Earth years, though the time dilation effects of interstellar travel made precise calculations impossible. The volunteers would be military personnel, scientists, and specialists chosen for their psychological stability and their ability to adapt to extreme conditions. It was called the Serpo Protocol, and it would become the most classified operation in human history. EB-1 died in 1952, but not before transmitting a message to his homeworld through technology that human scientists still don't fully understand. The reply came 3 years later, not as a radio signal, but as a physical object that materialized in the Nevada desert, a communications device that allowed real-time dialogue across the impossible distances of space. The Ebens confirmed the exchange. They would send a ship to Earth in 1965. 12 humans would be selected, trained, and prepared for a journey that would take them farther from home than any human had ever travelled. General Emmett Harrow, chosen to oversee the project, kept a private journal throughout the selection and training process. His final entry, dated June 15, 1965, read, "We're not sending soldiers, we're sending witnesses. God knows what they'll witness, but history will judge us by what they become." The selection process began in earnest in 1962. Military personnel from all branches were screened for psychological stability, physical fitness, and perhaps most importantly, their ability to keep secrets. The final 12 were chosen not just for their skills, but for their capacity to represent humanity to a species that had watched our civilization rise from the primordial mud. Among them was Major Elias Rourke, a linguist and xenobiology analyst who had been working on the EB communication project since 1951. His selection was never in doubt. He had spent 4 years learning to think like an alien, to see the universe through eyes that had evolved under different stars. If anyone could survive 10 years on an alien world and return with his sanity intact, it was Rourke. He would be wrong about the sanity part. June 1965. Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. The training facility existed in the space between official and unofficial, a collection of buildings that appeared on no maps and consumed resources that appeared in no budgets. For 3 years, 12 human beings prepared for a journey that would take them farther from Earth than the combined distance of every human expedition in history. Major Elias Rourke stood before a wall-sized star chart, his finger tracing the impossible line between Sol and Zeta Reticuli. 39 light-years. In human terms, it might as well have been 39 million. The Ebens had explained, through their mathematical language, that the journey would take approximately 10 months due to something they called gravitational corridor jumps, a method of faster-than-light travel that folded space like origami. "Still can't believe we're actually doing this," said Captain Sarah Chen, the mission's xenobiologist. She was one of only 2 women selected for the mission, chosen for her expertise in extremophile organisms and her psychological evaluation scores that suggested she could adapt to almost any environment. "Believe it," replied Dr. Marcus Webb, the team's physician. "In 3 days we'll be farther from home than any human has ever been, assuming we survive the trip." The 12 had been living, training and preparing together for 3 years. They knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, fears, and hopes better than most married couples. They had to. For the next 10 years, they would be the only humans on a world that existed under alien stars. The team was carefully balanced. 4 military officers, 3 scientists, 2 engineers, 2 medical personnel, and 1 linguist. Each had been chosen not just for their primary skills, but for their secondary abilities. Rourke, for instance, was not just a linguist, but also a trained pilot and electrical engineer. Chen was a xenobiologist, who also held degrees in geology and atmospheric science. Every member of the team was in effect a Swiss Army knife of human knowledge and capability. Dr. Inez Marlowe, the mission's Earthside coordinator, had spent the last 3 years developing the monitoring systems that would track the team's vital signs, psychological states, and mission progress across the vast distances of space. Her laboratory, buried 3 levels beneath Wright-Patterson, contained communication equipment that incorporated both human and EBEN technology. The biomonitoring systems are as ready as they can be, she reported to General Harrow during the final mission briefing. But we're operating on assumptions about physics that we don't fully understand. The EBENs assure us that quantum entanglement communication will work across interstellar distances, but we've never tested it. General Harrow nodded grimly. Doctor, this entire mission is built on assumptions. We're assuming the EBENs are telling the truth about their intentions. We're assuming our people can survive on their world. We're assuming they'll actually bring them back. He paused, lighting one of the cigars that had become his trademark during the project. We're assuming a lot of things because the alternative is to admit we have no idea what we're doing. The EBEN ship arrived on schedule, materializing in the Nevada desert with no fanfare, no dramatic light show, no Hollywood special effects. One moment the desert was empty, the next moment a craft roughly the size of a small apartment building sat on the sand as if it had always been there. The technology involved was so far beyond human understanding that the scientists monitoring the arrival could only describe it as impossible. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering that seemed to defy every law of physics. Its surface was smooth to the point of being frictionless, made of a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. There were no visible engines, no exhaust ports, no indication of how something so massive could move through space. It simply existed, a perfect example of technology so advanced it appeared to be magic. 3 EBENs emerged from the ship, moving with the fluid grace of beings who had evolved in lower gravity. They were taller than EB-1 had been, nearly 6 feet in height, with the same grey skin and oversized eyes that had become iconic in the years since Roswell. They communicated through a combination of telepathy and mathematical equations projected onto handheld devices that appeared to be made of crystallized light. The lead EBEN, designated EBE-2 by the human team, approached General Harrow with what could only be described as ceremony. Through the translation device, he transmitted a message that had been prepared for this moment. We welcome the children of Saul to journey with us. They will see wonders beyond their current understanding. They will return changed, but they will return. The 12 volunteers said their goodbyes to Earth in a sterile conference room that had been set up for the occasion. Family members had been told they were being deployed on a long-term classified mission. The truth was so far beyond the realm of possibility that even the cover story seemed incredible. Rourke's final Earthside journal entry, dated July 16, 1965, read, "Today, we leave the only world humans have ever known. I've spent 3 years preparing for this moment, learning about Serpo, studying EBEN culture, trying to understand what we're walking into. But standing here now, looking at that ship, I realise that nothing could have prepared us for this. We're not just leaving Earth, we're leaving everything that makes us human. I pray we can find our way back." The journey began with a sensation that defied description. The EBEN ship didn't launch or take off in any conventional sense. Reality simply shifted around them, as if the universe had decided that they were no longer on Earth, but somewhere else entirely. The transition was so smooth that for a moment, Rourke wondered if they had moved at all. It was only when he looked through the ship's viewing portal that he realised the magnitude of what had just happened. Below them, Earth hung in the void like a blue marble, already so distant that the continents were barely visible. They had travelled farther in 30 seconds than humans had travelled in the entire history of space exploration. The ship's interior was a study in a functional minimalism. Curved walls that seemed to be made of the same light-absorbing material as the exterior, floor surfaces that provided perfect traction without being rough, and lighting that appeared to emanate from the walls themselves. The Ebens had prepared a section of the ship for their human guests, complete with sleeping quarters, a common area, and what appeared to be a food preparation facility. But it was the navigation chamber that truly highlighted the gulf between human and Eben technology. The room was dominated by a three-dimensional star map that showed their position in real time, their trajectory through space represented by a thin line of light that stretched from Sol toward Zeta Reticuli. The mathematics involved in plotting their course was so complex that Dr. Webb, who held a doctorate in theoretical physics, admitted he couldn't even understand the basic principles involved. "How do you calculate a route through folded space?" he asked EBE-2 during one of their daily communication sessions. The Ebens' response, translated through the device, was both simple and profound. You don't calculate the route. You convince space to change its shape. The journey to Serpo would take 10 months ship time, but due to the effects of travelling through folded space, the actual passage of time was far more complex. According to the Eben calculations, they would arrive at Serpo having aged only about 8 months, while nearly a year would pass on Earth. The implications of this temporal displacement were staggering, but the human team had been prepared for it during their training. As Earth dwindled behind them and the stars ahead grew brighter, the 12 volunteers began to understand that they weren't just travelling to another world, they were travelling to another reality, one where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than absolute truths, where time itself could be manipulated, and where humanity's place in the universe was far smaller than anyone had ever imagined. 1966 to 1975, Serpo, Zeta Reticuli system. The first glimpse of Serpo came through the ship's viewing portal, as a rusty orange dot against the star-filled void. As they approached, the dot resolved into a world that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Continents and oceans were visible, but the colours were wrong. The land masses were various shades of orange and red, while the oceans appeared to be a deep purple-black. 2 suns hung in the sky, one larger and brighter than Sol, the other smaller and redder. "It's beautiful," whispered Lieutenant Angela Torres, the mission's communications specialist, as she watched the alien world grow larger in the viewport. "And terrifying." Dr. Chen was already taking readings with the portable instruments they'd brought from Earth. Atmospheric composition is roughly 60% nitrogen, 35% oxygen, with traces of argon and some compounds I don't recognise. It's breathable, but we'll need to monitor ourselves carefully for the first few months. The landing was as seamless as their departure from Earth had been. The ship simply settled onto the surface of Serpo as if it had always been there, the advanced technology making the arrival feel almost anticlimactic. When the boarding ramp lowered, the 12 humans got their first taste of alien air. It was hot, much hotter than they'd expected despite the briefings. The dual suns created a greenhouse effect that kept the surface temperature at a constant 107 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and humid, carrying scents that were both familiar and strange. There was something like ozone, something like metal, and underneath it all an organic smell that reminded Rourke of a forest after rain, but wrong somehow. The gravity was lighter than Earth's, about 0.7 g, which made movement feel bouncy and imprecise. After the first few hours, several team members complained of nausea and disorientation, as their inner ears struggled to adjust to the alien environment. But it was the sky that truly drove home the fact that they were no longer on Earth. The 2 suns cast complex shadows that shifted and changed throughout the day. The larger sun provided most of the light, while the smaller red sun painted everything with an orange tint that made the landscape look like a perpetual sunset. At night, when both suns had set, the sky was filled with more stars than any human had ever seen, the centre of the galaxy visible as a brilliant stream of light across the heavens. The Eben settlement was a marvel of integrated architecture. Rather than building structures that sat on the landscape, the Ebens had grown their city into the landscape itself. Buildings flowed organically from the ground. their walls and roofs indistinguishable from the natural rock formations. The entire settlement looked like it had been carved from a single piece of stone, with passages and chambers that followed the natural contours of the terrain. "It's like they think in 3 dimensions, observed Captain Chen as they were led through the settlement. "Human architecture is based on straight lines and right angles. This is based on curves and natural flow." The Ebons themselves were gracious hosts, but their behaviour was often puzzling to the human visitors. They lived in a society with no apparent hierarchy, no leaders, no government in any sense that humans could understand. Decisions were made through a form of consensus that seemed to involve telepathic communication. Crime was non-existent, not because of laws or punishment, but because the concept of harming another being was simply incomprehensible to them. Privacy, as humans understood it, didn't exist. The Ebons lived in communal spaces where thoughts and emotions were shared freely. They found the human need for individual space and private thoughts both fascinating and slightly disturbing. Several times during the first months, Rourke found himself being studied by groups of Ebons who were trying to understand why humans needed to be alone with their thoughts. The first death occurred 6 months after their arrival. Sergeant James Morrison, one of the engineers, collapsed while working on a communication array. Dr. Webb's examination revealed massive internal hemorrhaging, but the cause was unclear. The symptoms were unlike anything in human medical literature, and the Ebon medical techniques were too advanced for the human team to understand. "It's like his blood just forgot how to clot," Webb reported in his medical log. "Every test I can run suggests his body's rejecting something, but I can't identify what. The Ebons say it's a reaction to the radiation from their dual suns, but our monitoring equipment doesn't show dangerous levels." Morrison died 3 days later, the first human to die on an alien world. The team buried him in a small ceremony at the edge of the settlement, marking his grave with a simple stone cairn that would become a shrine for the remaining members of the mission. The second disappearance was more mysterious. Lieutenant Patricia Huang, the mission's geologist, went out on a solo survey expedition and never returned. Search parties found her equipment scattered across a wide area, but no sign of her body. The Ebons seemed genuinely puzzled by her disappearance, claiming that their world had no dangerous wildlife and that she couldn't have simply gotten lost. "She was studying the mineral formations about 5 kilometres from the settlement," reported Captain Torres. "Her last transmission was routine, just standard geological observations. Then nothing. It's like she just vanished." The loss of 2 team members in less than a year created a psychological crisis for the remaining 10. They were alone on an alien world, dependent on beings they didn't fully understand, with no way to contact Earth except through the Ebon communication systems. The isolation was more complete than any human had ever experienced. Rourke found himself changing in ways that were both subtle and profound. His journal entries, transmitted to Earth through the Ebon communication system, showed a gradual shift in perspective that worried the Earthside monitors. "I stopped dreaming of Earth," he wrote in a transmission dated September 1967, "and I started dreaming in images I didn't understand. Last night I dreamed I was swimming through space, surrounded by stars that sang in mathematical harmonies. When I woke up, I could still hear the music, and for a moment I understood what it meant. But the understanding faded as soon as I tried to write it down." The mission's psychologist, Dr. Amanda Stewart, noticed similar changes in the other team members. They were adapting to Serpo in ways that went beyond simple acclimatization. Their thought patterns were becoming more abstract, their problem-solving approaches more intuitive. They were becoming something new, something that was neither fully human nor fully alien. "We're changing," she reported to Earth in a classified transmission. "The change is subtle, but it's real. We're thinking differently, seeing the universe differently. I'm not sure we'll be the same people who left Earth when we return." The years passed in a rhythm dictated by the twin suns. Serpo's day cycle was 43.3 Earth hours, which meant that human circadian rhythms were constantly out of sync with the local environment. The team learned to sleep when exhaustion overcame them, rather than trying to maintain Earth normal schedules. They studied Ebon culture, technology and philosophy. transmitting their observations back to Earth through the quantum communication system. But the deeper they delved into Eben society, the more they realised how fundamentally different the two species were. Humans were individuals first and social beings second. Ebens were collective entities who occasionally experienced individuality as a temporary state. The Ebens, for their part, were equally fascinated by their human guests. They studied human behaviour with the intensity of anthropologists, trying to understand concepts like ambition, jealousy, and love. They were particularly puzzled by human creativity, the ability to imagine things that didn't exist and then work to make them real. They create stories, reported one Eben observer in a transmission that was intercepted by Earthside monitors. They create elaborate fictional narratives that serve no practical purpose. Yet these stories seem to provide them with emotional satisfaction. This behaviour is unique among the species we have encountered. By 1970, the mission had settled into a routine that was both productive and increasingly bizarre. The humans had learned to navigate Eben society, to communicate through the telepathic interface systems, and to survive in an environment that was constantly trying to kill them. But they were also losing their connection to Earth, to humanity, to the species they had been born to represent. The third death occurred in 1972. Dr. William Chen, the xenobiologist, succumbed to what appeared to be a form of cancer, but unlike any cancer seen on Earth. The tumours were crystalline in structure, as if his body was trying to transform into something that could better survive on Serpo. The fourth death was a suicide. Captain Robert Hayes, one of the military officers, walked into the desert during a dust storm and was never seen again. His final message, left on his personal recording device, was simple. I can't remember what it feels like to be human. I can't remember why that matters. By 1975, 8 members of the original 12 remained. They had become something unprecedented in human history, a permanent alien diaspora, humans who had lived longer on an alien world than on Earth. They had adapted, evolved, and survived, but the cost was measured in ways that couldn't be quantified in mission reports. Rourke's journal entries from the final year on Serpo showed a man who had gained cosmic perspective at the cost of his humanity. I understand now why the Ebens agreed to this exchange, he wrote. They weren't studying us to learn about human nature. They were studying us to see what we would become when we were removed from the context that made us human. We are their experiment in forced evolution. The message that a ship would arrive to take them back to Earth came as both a relief and a terror. After 10 years on Serpo, the prospect of returning to a world they barely remembered was almost as frightening as the original journey into the unknown. 1975 to 1978, Blackhall Station, Antarctica. The journey back to Earth was a mirror image of their departure, but the 8 humans who entered the Eben ship were fundamentally different from the 12 who had left a decade earlier. They were thinner, their skin bearing a greyish pallor that came from years under alien suns. Their eyes held a depth that spoke of having seen wonders and horrors in equal measure. Most disturbing of all, they moved with an unconscious grace that was distinctly non-human. Dr. Inez Marlowe, now the chief of xenobiology at Wright-Patterson, watched the ship's arrival through high-powered telescopes from a monitoring station in Nevada. The vessel materialised in the same manner as its departure, reality simply shifting to accommodate its presence. But something was different about this arrival. The ship lingered longer before touching down, as if its occupants were reluctant to complete their journey. Biomonitoring shows 8 human life signs, reported her assistant, Dr. Frances Cole. But the patterns are unusual. Their brain activity is showing wavelengths we've never recorded in human subjects. The reunion between the returning team and their Earthside counterparts took place in a sterile debriefing facility that had been constructed specifically for this purpose. The room was designed to feel comfortable and familiar, with earth plants, normal lighting and photographs of home. But the returning astronauts seemed uncomfortable in the space, as if they had forgotten how to exist in human-designed environments. Rourke was the first to speak, his voice carrying an accent that hadn't been there when he left. 10 years, 4 months, and 16 days, he said. his eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the debriefing room. That's how long we were gone in ship time, but it feels like a lifetime. Several lifetimes. The initial medical examinations revealed changes that were both subtle and profound. The returning team members showed increased bone density, improved cardiovascular function, and neurological modifications that suggested their brains had adapted to process information in ways that were distinctly non-human. Most remarkably, they all showed evidence of low-level telepathic abilities, something that hadn't existed in humans before the mission. They're still human, Dr. Marlowe reported to General Harrow, but they've been changed on a fundamental level. It's as if exposure to Ebon society has activated dormant potentials in human neurology. They're thinking in ways that we can't fully comprehend. The debriefing process was intended to last 3 months. It ended up taking 3 years. The returning team was housed at Blackhall Station, a facility that officially didn't exist on the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica. The location was chosen for its isolation and its ability to maintain perfect security. The 8 survivors would live there for the next 3 years, undergoing the most intensive debriefing in military history. The stories they told were both fascinating and terrifying. They described a world where the laws of physics were fluid, where consciousness could be shared between individuals, where technology and biology had merged to create a civilization that was incomprehensibly advanced. But they also described a society that was utterly alien, where human concepts of individuality, privacy, and personal autonomy simply didn't exist. The Ebons don't understand love, explained Dr. Stewart during one of her sessions. They understand attachment, cooperation, and mutual benefit. But the idea that 2 beings could form an exclusive emotional bond that transcends rational analysis is completely foreign to them. They studied our human relationships the way we might study the mating rituals of insects. The most disturbing revelations came from the coded messages that the 2 missing team members had left behind. Hidden in the crystalline data storage devices that the Ebons had given them were personal logs that painted a picture of a mission that had gone far beyond its original parameters. Lieutenant Huang hadn't disappeared accidentally. She had been selected by the Ebons for what they called biological integration, a process that would allow her to survive permanently on Serpo by merging her consciousness with their collective intelligence. The process was described in clinical terms, but the implications were horrifying. Sergeant Morrison's death hadn't been from radiation exposure. He had been deliberately infected with a biological agent that would allow the Ebons to study human immune responses. His death was a necessary part of their research into human biological vulnerabilities. "We weren't guests," Rourke wrote in his classified debrief report. "We were lab rats, highly valued, well-treated lab rats, but lab rats nonetheless. The Ebons were studying us to understand how humans might be modified to survive in their environment. The exchange program was the first step in what they see as the inevitable integration of our species." The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. Of the 8 survivors, 3 suffered complete psychological breakdowns within the first year of their return. They were hospitalized at a classified facility where they received round-the-clock care from psychiatrists who had been cleared for the highest levels of government secrecy. Captain Sarah Chen, the xenobiologist who had marvelled at Serpo's beauty during the landing, was found in her quarters at Blackhall Station with her wrists slit. Her suicide note was brief. "I can't live in a world where the sky only has one sun. I can't live knowing that we were never meant to come back unchanged. I can't live with what I've become." The remaining 5 survivors completed their debrief in 1978, but they were never allowed to fully return to society. They were given new identities, comfortable lives, and stipends that ensured they would never need to work again. But they were also monitored constantly, their every movement tracked, their communications intercepted, their contacts limited to other members of the program. The official files on the Serpo mission were buried under Project Morning Veil, a classification level so secret that fewer than 20 people in the government knew it existed. The mission became a ghost story, a legend whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon and the underground facilities of the defense establishment. "We made first contact," General Harrow wrote in his final report on the project, "and then we buried it in concrete." The technology that the Evans had shared was quietly integrated into human development programs. Advances in materials, science, energy generation, and communication systems over the following decades could be traced back to principles learned on Serpo. But the source of these innovations was hidden behind layers of classification and misdirection. The 5 survivors lived quiet lives, scattered across the country, each monitored by handlers who posed as friends or neighbours. They aged slowly, their modified biology extending their lifespans far beyond normal human parameters. They rarely spoke to each other, the shared trauma of their experience creating a bond that was too painful to acknowledge. But they remembered. They remembered the orange skies and the twin suns, the singing crystals and the collective consciousness of the Ebons. They remembered being part of something larger than themselves, and they remembered the price of that knowledge. And one of them, Major Elias Rourke, began to plan a way to tell the world what had really happened. 2005, undisclosed location. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, sent from an untraceable account to a mailing list of UFO researchers and conspiracy theorists. The subject line was simple: Project Serpo, the truth about Earth's first interstellar mission. The sender identified himself only as anonymous request. Victor Martinez, a former government employee who had become a prominent figure in the UFO research community, was the first to recognize the significance of what he was reading. The email contained detailed technical specifications, biological data, and personal accounts that were far too complex and internally consistent to be fabricated. "This is either the most elaborate hoax in history," Martinez said during a late-night phone call to his research partner, "or we're looking at the biggest leak of classified information since the Pentagon Papers." The first email was followed by dozens more, each containing additional details about the Serpo mission. Maps of the alien world's geography, atmospheric composition data, descriptions of Ebon technology, and personal logs from the mission members. The level of detail was staggering, covering everything from the biochemistry of alien food sources to the mathematical principles underlying faster-than-light travel. But it was the personal accounts that gave the documents their authenticity. The fear, wonder, and gradual psychological transformation of the mission members came through in every report. These weren't the sanitized accounts of a government cover-up. These were the raw, unfiltered experiences of humans who had lived through something unprecedented. Day 847. Lieutenant Torres reports increasing difficulty with temporal perception. She says the days feel like they're stretching, as if time itself is elastic here. Dr. Webb confirms similar symptoms in 3 other team members. We're changing, but we don't know what we're changing into. The emails painted a picture of a mission that had succeeded beyond all expectations and failed in ways that the planners had never anticipated. The humans had survived on an alien world, learned about a civilization that spanned multiple star systems, and returned with knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of the universe. But they had also been changed in ways that made them question their own humanity. Rourke, writing under his anonymous alias, included details that only someone who had actually lived through the experience could know. The way the twin suns created complex shadow patterns that shifted throughout the day. The taste of Ebon food, which was nutritious but had a metallic aftertaste that never quite went away. The sound of wind through the crystalline structures of the alien city, which created harmonies that were almost musical. "The Ebons don't dream," he wrote in one email. "They share experiences while they rest, but they don't create the random neural narratives that humans call dreams. They were fascinated by our dreams, collected them somehow, studied them like we might study a new species of insect. They said our dreams were proof that humans were still evolving, still becoming something new." The emails also contained warnings. The Ebons hadn't abandoned their interest in humanity. They were still monitoring Earth, still studying human development, still planning for what they called the next phase of integration. The government's response was swift and predictable. Official denials were issued through multiple channels. the Defense Intelligence Agency released a statement calling the emails an elaborate work of science fiction designed to mislead the public. Richard Doty, a real Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent who had been involved in UFO disinformation campaigns, publicly confirmed that such a mission had taken place but claimed the details were exaggerated. But the cat was out of the bag. The Serpo emails spread across the internet like wildfire, translated into dozens of languages, analysed by researchers around the world. The level of technical detail made it impossible to dismiss as simple fiction, while the emotional authenticity of the personal accounts resonated with anyone who had ever wondered about humanity's place in the cosmos. Martinez found himself at the centre of a media storm that he hadn't anticipated. Television interviews, documentary crews, book offers, and constant harassment from both believers and skeptics. But through it all, he never heard from Anonymous' request again. The emails stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving behind a mystery that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. Present day, Arecibo Observatory, Puerto Rico, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the granddaughter of Dr. Inez Marlowe, had inherited more than just her grandmother's scientific curiosity. She had also inherited access to certain classified archives that officially didn't exist. As an astroarchaeologist specialising in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, she was perfectly positioned to recognise patterns that others might miss. The signal arrived on a frequency that was theoretically impossible for natural phenomena to generate. It lasted exactly 4.7 seconds and contained mathematical sequences that matched patterns described in the Serpo emails. More significantly, it contained something that made Elena's blood run cold. Coordinates. Not coordinates for Earth, but coordinates in space. A location in the Zeta Reticuli system that matched descriptions of Serpo's orbital position with frightening accuracy. "It's a recall signal," she whispered to her research partner as they analysed the data. "They're calling someone home." But the most terrifying possibility wasn't that the signal was meant for the two humans who had remained on Serpo 40 years earlier. The most terrifying possibility was that it was meant for their descendants, for hybrid beings who had been born under alien suns and were now ready to return to Earth. Eleanor published her findings in a paper that was immediately classified by the National Security Agency. But word leaked out, as it always does, and the UFO research community began connecting the dots between the Serpo emails, the mysterious signal, and a series of unexplained atmospheric phenomena that had been occurring around the world. 3 months after the signal was detected, Major Elias Rourke was found dead in his government-provided apartment. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who knew him suspected otherwise. At age 89, he had been the last surviving member of the original Serpo mission, the keeper of secrets that governments would kill to protect. His final journal entry, discovered hidden in a safety deposit box, read, "They're coming back. Not the Ebens, but our people. The ones we left behind have become something new, something that belongs neither to Earth nor to Serpo. God help us all when they arrive, because they'll see us as we saw the Ebens, primitive beings clinging to an outdated definition of what it means to be intelligent life." The story of the Serpo Protocol remains officially denied by every government agency that has ever been asked about it. But in the deep archives of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in the classified sections of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and in the memories of a handful of aging scientists, the truth persists. Humanity made contact with an alien civilization. We sent our best and brightest to learn about them, and what we learned was that in the vast cosmos, being human might not be an advantage. It might be a limitation that evolution is eager to overcome. The orange skies of Serpo still shine in the dreams of those who remember. The twin suns still cast their complex shadows across the memories of the survivors. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, our lost astronauts are coming home, changed beyond recognition, carrying knowledge that will either elevate humanity or replace it entirely. The Serpo Protocol was never just about exploring space. It was about discovering what we would become when we finally left the cradle of Earth behind. The answer, it seems, is something that our species isn't quite ready to accept. But ready or not, our cosmic education is about to continue. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2027, buried between spam messages and LinkedIn notifications. Silas Rourke almost deleted it, mistaking the sender's address for another phishing attempt, but the subject line stopped him cold. Immediate contract opportunity. Devon Island Geological Survey. Devon Island. Even the name sent a chill through him. Silas had spent the last 5 years analysing satellite imagery for various aerospace contractors, his days consumed by pixel-perfect examinations of terrain that most humans would never see in person. At 32, he'd developed an eye for inconsistencies that his supervisors both valued and feared. His last position had ended abruptly when he'd questioned discrepancies in some orbital photography, asking too many questions about why certain images seemed staged. The email was from Dr. Kiran Solvi, Director of Field Operations for Volstrix Dynamics. The company name was familiar. They'd been mentioned in aerospace journals as a NASA contractor specialising in Mars mission preparation. The offer was generous. 3 months on Devon Island, Canada, conducting geological surveys for future off-world missions. The pay was almost too good to be true. Silas read the email 3 times before responding. He'd heard about Devon Island, the largest uninhabited island on Earth, located in the Canadian Arctic. Its barren, crater-scarred landscape was so similar to Mars that NASA had been using it as a training ground for years. The isolation appealed to him. After months of unemployment and mounting bills, the contract felt like salvation. Within 48 hours, he was on a plane to Resolute Bay, Nunavut. The flight to Devon Island was unlike anything Silas had experienced. The small charter plane carried only 8 passengers, all bound for the same destination. His fellow travellers were an interesting mix. A field biologist named Talia Miro, with kind eyes and nervous energy. A stoic mission director who introduced himself simply as Dr. Solvi, and several technical specialists who spoke in hushed tones about equipment protocols and communication blackouts. As the plane descended toward Devon Island, Silas pressed his face to the small window. The landscape below was alien. Rust-coloured earth stretched endlessly, broken only by ancient impact craters and the occasional rocky outcrop. It looked exactly like the Mars surface images he'd studied countless times in his career. The resemblance was uncanny, almost too perfect. The landing strip was nothing more than a graded dirt runway, but the infrastructure surrounding it was surprisingly sophisticated. Silas counted at least a dozen black shipping containers arranged in precise geometric patterns, connected by cables and surrounded by communication arrays that seemed far too advanced for a simple geological survey. Drones circled overhead in predetermined patterns, their cameras tracking the new arrivals. "Welcome to Mars," Dr. Solvi said with a thin smile as they disembarked. "You're home for the next 3 months." The comment struck Silas as odd. Most people would have said, "Welcome to Devon Island," or "Welcome to the Arctic." But Dr. Solvi had said Mars, as if the location's resemblance to the red planet was its primary identity. During the initial briefing, held in a heated container that served as the mission's command centre, Silas learned that their official purpose was to evaluate geological formations and test equipment for future Mars missions. The work seemed straightforward enough. Take samples, analyse terrain, and document everything for NASA's archives. But there were unusual restrictions that set his analytical mind on edge. No personal phones were allowed. All communication with the outside world had to go through official channels, using encrypted tablets provided by Volstrix. The internet connection was heavily filtered, with access limited to specific scientific databases and approved communication platforms. Even more strangely, they were required to maintain radio silence during certain hours of the day, with no explanation provided for these communication blackouts. "Security protocols," Dr. Solvi explained when Silas questioned the restrictions. "We're testing sensitive equipment here. Can't have any unauthorized signals interfering with our work." The explanation felt rehearsed, like a line from a script. That first night, Silas lay in his assigned bunk, listening to the Arctic wind howl across the barren landscape. The accommodation was a modified shipping container, surprisingly comfortable but completely isolated from the outside world. Through the small window, he could see the communication arrays blinking in the darkness, their lights creating an almost hypnotic pattern against the starless sky. Something felt wrong about this place, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The first week on Devon Island passed in a blur of routine geological surveys and equipment testing. Silas found himself working closely with Talia Moreau, the field biologist, whose job was to study extremophile organisms that might provide insights into potential Martian life. She was intelligent and observant, with a background in astrobiology that made her invaluable to the mission. It was Talia who first pointed out the inconsistencies. "Have you noticed the rover tracks?" she asked during their third day of fieldwork. They were standing near a section of terrain that NASA claimed to use for rover simulations, examining the reddish soil that looked remarkably similar to Martian regolith. Silas looked where she was pointing. Clear tyre tracks crisscrossed the area in complex patterns, some overlapping others in ways that suggested multiple passes over the same ground. But here was the strange part. According to their mission schedule, the rover simulations weren't supposed to begin for another 2 weeks. "Maybe they're from previous missions," Silas suggested, though he wasn't convinced by his own explanation. "Look at the degradation pattern," Talia said, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. "These are fresh, maybe a few days old at most, but the weather reports show we had a sandstorm last week that should have erased any surface markings." Silas pulled out his tablet and accessed the mission archives. The official record showed no rover activity on Devon Island for the past 6 months. According to Volstrax's documentation, this was the first operational mission of the year. "That's impossible," he muttered, comparing the physical evidence with the digital records. "Either the records are wrong, or someone's been running rover simulations without documenting them," Talia finished. They spent the next hour photographing the tracks and taking detailed measurements. The tyre patterns were consistent with NASA's current Mars rover design, but the paths seemed almost too perfect, following routes that would provide ideal camera angles and dramatic geological backdrops. It was as if someone had choreographed the rover's movement for maximum visual impact. That evening, Silas decided to do some digging. Using his encrypted tablet, he accessed Volstrax's internal network and began searching for any reference to previous Devon Island missions. The search results were frustratingly sparse, just vague references to preparatory surveys and equipment calibration, with no detailed logs or photographic evidence. But buried in a technical support forum, he found something interesting. A post from a Volstrax technician dated 3 months earlier mentioned troubleshooting Studio B connectivity issues on Devon Island. The post had been quickly deleted, but cached fragments remained in the system. Studio B. That was a designation he hadn't heard during any of their briefings. The next morning, Silas set out to explore the island more thoroughly. The official mission area was relatively small, confined to a valley between 2 low ridges. But Devon Island was enormous, over 21,000 square miles of uninhabited wilderness. Surely there were areas beyond their designated zone that might hold answers. He found Studio B by accident, following a set of heavy vehicle tracks that led away from the main camp. The tracks were partially obscured by recent snowfall, but they formed a clear path toward a cluster of boulders about 2 miles from the official mission perimeter. Hidden among the rocks was a structure that definitely wasn't in any of the mission documentation. It looked like a large shipping container, but heavily modified with additional ventilation systems and what appeared to be a satellite uplink array. A discreet sign near the entrance read, "Studio B, authorized personnel only." The entrance was secured with a biometric scanner, far more sophisticated than anything else Silas had seen on the island. When he approached, the scanner activated automatically, bathing his face in red light before flashing an "access denied" message. He circled the structure, looking for windows or any other way to see inside. The building was completely sealed, with no external indication of its purpose, but the ventilation system was running constantly, and he could hear the faint hum of electronic equipment from within. On his way back to camp, Silas noticed something else that made his pulse quicken. Mounted on a nearby ridge was a high-resolution camera system, perfectly positioned to capture the main rover testing area. The camera wasn't part of the official mission equipment. He'd memorized every piece of technology listed in their operational briefing. That night he shared his discoveries with Talia during their evening meal. They sat in the communal dining container, speaking in whispers while the other team members focused on their own conversations. "I've been noticing things too," Talia admitted. "The communication blackouts always seem to coincide with drone activity, and yesterday I saw Dr. Solvey uploading files to a server that's not part of our official network." "What kind of files?" "Video footage, Mars rover footage, or at least footage that looked like it was from Mars, but the timestamp showed it was recorded here, on Devon Island." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic weather. "Are you saying they're filming fake Mars footage?" "I don't know what I'm saying yet, but something's not right about this place." They agreed to continue investigating, but carefully. Whatever was happening on Devon Island, it was clearly being kept secret from most of the mission team. They needed more evidence before drawing any conclusions. The opportunity came during their second week, when a severe weather system moved across the island. The storm brought blinding snow and winds that made outdoor work impossible, forcing the entire team to remain in the heated containers for 36 hours. But weather emergencies also meant relaxed security protocols. During the storm, normal communication blackouts were suspended, and the constant drone surveillance was grounded. It was the perfect time for Silas to make his move. He waited until 2 a.m. when the camp was quiet except for the howling wind. Using a maintenance access code he'd observed Dr. Solvey enter earlier that week, Silas slipped out of his accommodation and made his way through the storm towards Studio B. The journey was treacherous. The snow was so thick that he could barely see 5 feet ahead, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet with every step. But the storm also provided perfect cover. Anyone monitoring the camp's security systems would dismiss his movement as weather-related interference. Studio B loomed out of the swirling snow like a geometric ghost. The biometric scanner was still active, its red light cutting through the darkness. But Silas had come prepared. Earlier that day, he'd managed to lift a security keycard from Dr. Solvey's jacket while helping him clear ice from the communication arrays. The keycard worked, the scanner flashed green, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, Silas found himself in an airlock-style entry chamber. After a few seconds, the inner door opened automatically, revealing a space that took his breath away. Studio B was a fully equipped television production facility, disguised as a simple shipping container. The main area housed a massive green screen dome, at least 40 feet in diameter, surrounded by professional lighting equipment and camera systems. Computer workstations lined the walls, their screens displaying what appeared to be Mars terrain data and rover telemetry. But the most shocking discovery was in the centre of the dome, a perfect replica of a Mars rover, complete with camera systems and scientific instruments. The rover was positioned on a section of artificial Martian terrain, with the green screen providing a 360-degree backdrop for filming. Silas approached one of the computer workstations, his hands trembling with excitement and fear. The screen showed real-time feeds from multiple cameras, all focused on the replica rover. But these weren't test feeds. They were being actively uploaded to NASA's public servers, complete with official timestamps and mission data. A thick operations binder lay open on the desk, its pages filled with detailed information that made Silas's blood run cold. The cover page read, "Either script, Sol 3247. Inside, he found page after page of pre-written content, Twitter posts for NASA's official Mars rover account, complete with specific timestamps and engagement metrics, scripted rover malfunctions and recovery procedures, a public emotion index that tracked social media responses to Mars mission updates, detailed storyboards for discovering Martian geological formations, technical specifications for creating realistic Mars weather effects. One page contained a chilling directive: maintain public interest through carefully managed crisis scenarios. Rover malfunction events should occur every 45 to 60 days to maximise emotional investment without triggering skepticism. Silas photographed every page using his tablet's camera, working quickly while keeping an eye on the door. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a Mars simulation facility. It was a content creation studio, designed to manufacture fake Mars exploration footage for public consumption. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a locked filing cabinet, Silas found a folder marked ECHO Protocol, Historical Documentation. Inside were mission reports dating back to 2014, detailing the failure of primary Mars mission objectives and the implementation of narrative maintenance protocols. According to the documents, the real Mars rover mission had encountered catastrophic problems in 2014, problems that would have ended public support for space exploration if revealed. Instead of admitting failure, NASA had partnered with private contractors to create a false narrative of continued success. Devon Island had been chosen as the perfect filming location because of its natural similarity to Mars. The isolated location and extreme weather conditions ensured that unauthorized access was nearly impossible. Over the past 13 years, hundreds of hours of Mars footage had been created here and seamlessly integrated into NASA's official communications. The scope of the deception was staggering. Every Mars rover photo, every geological discovery, every triumph and setback had been carefully scripted and filmed on this frozen island in the Canadian Arctic. Silas spent over an hour documenting everything, copying files to a hidden partition on his tablet. The evidence was overwhelming, but he needed to be strategic about how to use it. Going public immediately would be dangerous. The people running this operation had too much invested to let it be exposed easily. As he prepared to leave, Silas noticed something else that made his heart race. A communication log on one of the workstations showed recent messages between Devon Island and multiple government agencies. The message headers contained phrases like containment protocols and asset retrieval procedures. They weren't just creating fake Mars footage, they were prepared to deal with anyone who discovered the truth. Silas made it back to his accommodation without being detected, but sleep was impossible. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. The Mars mission that had inspired millions of people around the world was a lie. Worse, it was a lie backed by enormous resources and sophisticated security measures. He needed to find a way to get the evidence off the island, but the communication restrictions made that nearly impossible. All internet access was monitored, and file transfers were automatically scanned for unauthorized content. Even if he could upload the evidence, there was no guarantee it wouldn't be intercepted before reaching the outside world. The next morning, Silas noticed changes in the camp's atmosphere. Dr. Solvey seemed more watchful, and several team members who had been friendly before now avoided eye contact. Most disturbing of all, the drone surveillance had intensified. The unmanned aircraft now followed individual team members during their outdoor work, maintaining constant visual contact. "Something's wrong," Talia whispered during their midday meal. "I tried to access my personal email this morning, and the system flagged it as a security violation. They're monitoring everything more closely now." Silas nodded, careful not to reveal what he'd discovered. He needed to be sure who he could trust before sharing the evidence from Studio B. That afternoon, while conducting routine soil sampling in the rover testing area, Silas noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The rover tracks had changed again, new patterns overlaying the old ones, creating a complex maze of tyre marks. But according to the mission schedule, no rover testing was supposed to occur for another week. He followed the tracks to their termination point near the cluster of boulders that concealed Studio B. Hidden among the rocks was a second rover, identical to the one he'd seen in the studio, but this one was actively being used for outdoor filming. As he watched through binoculars, Silas saw a small crew emerge from Studio B. They were setting up camera equipment and preparing to film the rover in action. The entire operation was being conducted with military precision, with crew members communicating through encrypted radio systems. But the most chilling realization was that this wasn't a simulation or training exercise. The crew was actively creating new Mars footage that would be released to the public within days. The deception was ongoing, happening in real time. That evening, Silas made a decision that would change everything. He needed to contact the outside world, regardless of the risk. Using his tablet, he accessed a hidden partition where he'd installed an encrypted communication app during his first week on the island. The app connected to satellite networks that bypassed Volstrax's monitoring systems. but using it was extremely dangerous. If detected, it would immediately reveal that he'd been conducting unauthorized activities. Silas crafted a careful message to a journalist friend in Toronto, someone he trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly. He attached selected photos from Studio B and a brief explanation of what he'd discovered. "The Mars mission is fake," he wrote. "They're filming everything on Devon Island and passing it off as genuine exploration footage. I have evidence, but I'm not safe here. If something happens to me, publish everything." He sent the message at 3 a.m. when network monitoring was typically at its lowest level. The upload took nearly 20 minutes, and every second felt like an eternity. The next morning, Silas woke to find Talia missing from the morning briefing. Dr. Solvey explained that she'd been transferred to another project due to family circumstances, but her personal belongings were still in her accommodation, and there was no record of any flight departures from the island. "Where did she go?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "That's classified information, Doctor," Solvey replied. "I'm sure you understand the need for operational security." But Silas understood something else entirely. Talia had been asking too many questions, and now she was gone. The same thing could happen to him at any moment. That afternoon, while conducting routine geological surveys, Silas discovered something that confirmed his worst fears. Hidden in a rock crevice near the rover testing area was a small electronic device, a signal booster for encrypted communications. The device was still warm, indicating recent use. But more importantly, it was tuned to a frequency that he recognized from his signal intelligence training in the military. It was the frequency used by Echo Protocol. Echo Protocol was a military-grade communication system designed for deep cover operations. The name had appeared in the Studio B documentation, but Silas had assumed it was just another code name for the Mars Deception Project. Now he realized the truth was far more sinister. Echo Protocol wasn't just about fake Mars footage. It was a comprehensive disinformation system designed to control public perception of space exploration, and Devon Island was just one node in a much larger network. That night, Silas intercepted a message on the Echo Protocol frequency. The transmission was heavily encrypted, but he managed to decode fragments using military software he'd installed on his tablet. The message was chilling. "Subject has accessed restricted areas. Recommend immediate containment. Retrieval team dispatched. Maintain operational security until asset extraction complete." They knew he'd been in Studio B, they knew he'd discovered the truth, and they were coming for him. Silas had less than 12 hours before the retrieval team arrived. The encrypted message had included a timeline. ETA 0600 hours, weather permitting. It was already past midnight, and the Arctic dawn would bring his captors. He considered his options carefully. The camp was isolated with no means of independent transportation. The nearest settlement was over 100 miles away, across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Even if he could somehow survive the journey, he would likely be tracked and captured before reaching safety. His only hope was the abandoned weather station that Talia had mentioned during their first week. She'd discovered it during a biological survey, about 15 miles northwest of the main camp. The station had been defunct for years, but it might still have functional communication equipment. Silas spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for his escape. He packed emergency supplies, downloaded offline maps to his tablet, and created multiple backup copies of the evidence from Studio B. Most importantly, he configured his tablet to automatically upload all data to several cloud storage services if he failed to check in within 72 hours. At 4 a.m, he slipped out of his accommodation and began the treacherous journey across the frozen landscape. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind cut through his Arctic gear like a blade. But the harsh conditions also provided perfect cover. No one would expect him to attempt such a dangerous journey in these conditions. The weather station was even more isolated than he'd expected. The building was partially buried in snow, its communication arrays twisted and broken by years of Arctic storms. But the structure was still intact, and more importantly, it was equipped with an emergency satellite uplink system. Silas spent 4 hours getting the equipment operational, using components salvaged from the damaged arrays. The system was primitive compared to Volstrax's sophisticated network, but it would be enough to upload his evidence to multiple servers around the world. As he worked, he could hear aircraft in the distance, helicopters conducting search patterns around the main camp. The retrieval team had arrived, and they would soon discover his absence. The satellite uplink finally came online at 11 a.m. Silas uploaded everything: the photos from Studio B, the Echo Protocol documentation, the communication logs, and a detailed written account of his experiences on Devon Island. He sent copies to journalists, government officials, and several scientific institutions that had been involved in Mars exploration. But as he prepared to leave the weather station, Silas heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Through the building's ice-covered windows, he could see 2 black aircraft circling the area, their occupants clearly searching for him. The retrieval team had found him. The helicopters landed simultaneously, disgorging a team of 6 people dressed in Arctic gear and carrying military-style equipment. They moved with professional precision, surrounding the weather station within minutes. "Mr. Rourke," a voice called through a megaphone. "This is Agent Ray Dinnis with the Department of Scientific Security. We need to speak with you about your recent activities." Silas had never heard of the Department of Scientific Security, but the title sounded official enough to be believable. He remained silent, hoping they would assume the station was empty. "We know you're inside," Agent Dinnis continued. "We're here to help you understand the situation. There's been a misunderstanding about your assignment on Devon Island." The approach was sophisticated, not threatening, but offering a reasonable explanation for everything he'd witnessed. It was the kind of psychological manipulation that suggested extensive training in handling whistleblowers. "Mr. Rourke, we know you've accessed classified materials. We're not here to harm you. We're here to provide context for what you've seen and help you understand the larger picture." Silas made his decision. Using the weather station's emergency exit, he slipped out of the building and began moving toward a cluster of boulders that might provide cover. The landscape was completely exposed, but the rocks were his only hope of avoiding immediate capture. He made it 50 yards before the tranquilizer dart hit him. The drug worked quickly, flooding his system with a warm numbness that made his limbs heavy and his vision blurry. As consciousness faded, he heard Agent Dinnis speaking into a radio. "Asset secured. Initiate memory protocol. Clean sweep authorization granted." The last thing Silas remembered was being lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into one of the helicopters. As the aircraft lifted off, he caught a glimpse of the weather station below. A team of technicians was already dismantling the communication equipment, erasing any evidence of his desperate attempt to contact the outside world. 6 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist in Toronto, received an anonymous email containing several gigabytes of encrypted data. The files detailed an elaborate conspiracy involving fake Mars exploration footage, military-grade psychological operations, and the systematic elimination of whistleblowers. The evidence was compelling, but when Dr. Chen attempted to verify the story, she encountered a series of dead ends. Volstrix Dynamics had no record of anyone named Silas Rourke. Devon Island research stations denied any knowledge of suspicious activities. Most disturbing of all, there was no evidence that Silas Rourke had ever existed. Birth records, employment history, educational credentials, everything that would normally document a person's life had been scrubbed from official databases. It was as if 32 years of existence had been systematically erased. Dr. Chen spent months investigating, but every lead turned into a dead end. The few people who claimed to remember Silas Rourke gradually changed their stories, insisting they had been mistaken or confused. The anonymous email remained the only evidence of his existence. On a cold March morning, almost exactly 1 year after Silas Rourke had accepted a contract to work on Devon Island, NASA released a new batch of Mars rover photos. The images showed spectacular geological formations and evidence of ancient water activity, exactly the kind of discoveries that captured public imagination and justified continued space exploration funding. But in the corner of one photo, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small detail that shouldn't have been there. A weathered signpost, partially obscured by artificial Martian terrain, with text that read, Ward Glacier, Nunavut. Ward Glacier was located on Devon Island, in the Canadian Arctic territory of Nunavut. The photo was viewed by millions of people around the world, but only a handful noticed the geographic impossibility. Those who did were quickly dismissed as conspiracy theorists, their observations lost in the noise of social media and dismissed by official fact-checkers. The Mars exploration program continued, releasing regular updates about humanity's greatest space adventure. The public remained fascinated by the Red Planet, unaware that their dreams of interplanetary exploration were being manufactured in a frozen studio thousands of miles from the nearest rocket launch pad. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of classified government programs, a file marked Echo Protocol, Silas Rourke, was sealed and archived, containing the complete psychological profile of a man who had never existed. Dr. Chen kept the encrypted files, but she never published the story. The evidence was too extraordinary to believe, and the implications too dangerous to pursue. Sometimes, late at night, she would examine the Mars rover photos, looking for other signs of terrestrial geography hidden in the alien landscape. She never found any, but she never stopped looking. The Red Planet remained red, the public remained fascinated, and the truth remained buried in the Arctic ice of Devon Island, the place where Mars came to Earth, and where inconvenient questions disappeared forever. Mars, as it turned out, was indeed farther away than anyone had imagined, but not in the way they had been told.